Hello, everybody who's here and everybody who's watching later. This is the first meeting of the Philosophy Club at Sacramento State University in spring of 2022. It's happening. It's finally happening again. Alternatively, we're back. Take for that what you will. The agenda for today is just going to be a presentation on what I believe the PowerPoint said, democracy, from Professor Park from Sacramento State University. And then however much time is left, we're just going to go and discuss the various points at our leisure. So yeah, thanks for tuning in. And I'll turn the mic over to Professor Park. Thank you.
All right, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so today what I'm going to talk about is this kind of theory of the best. So, what we're interested in here today is what's the best form of government. For example, there are different forms of government like democracy, meritocracy, there are monarchies, dictatorships, and things like that. And we're going to look at that question, especially in light of issues concerning minority justice. And what I'm going to advocate for is what I call a meritocratic democracy, a view that fuses a meritocracy with a democracy as being better than democracy and better than an epistocracy for minority justice and minority issues and minority rights. Okay, so let me just get down some kind of thesis statements and some introductory information here. So one person I'm going to be kind of attacking is Jason Brennan. Jason Brennan, he's a contemporary political philosopher. He contends that democracies have notable deficiencies in supporting minority justice and posits, he endorses an epistocracy or rule of the knowledgeable as a better form of government in this regard. So he's someone who endorses an epistocracy. And don't worry, I'll be getting into what the distinction is between epistocracy and meritocracy and the like. However, insofar as several variants of an epistocracy concentrates voting influence on people in positions of power, like educated, wealthy white males, I contend that such forms of an epistocracy still have serious problems in handling the interests of those who are oppressed. Moreover, I contend that other versions of an epistocracy are unjustified. All right, so within epistocracy, there are different variants, and I'll argue that those variants are not that great for minorities and minority interests. Instead, what I will argue is that a hybrid view that fuses a meritocracy or rule by the merited with democracy can do a better job than an epistocracy and democracy alone in handling minority distributed justice in the legislative and executive branches. All right, so basically a meritocracy is ruled by the merited. And the idea with a meritocracy is that in order for relevant leaders, such as in the legislative and executive branches, to attain office, they have to kind of pass certain merit-based requirements. And different meritocracy theorists, they put forth different kinds of merit-based requirements. For example, you could have them passing tests, have experience requirements in local government. Some endorse having kind of references, people vouching from you from senior politicians, senior public servants. So there's a whole wide variety education experience requirements. So meritocracy, there's a kind of a whole slew of various possibilities in regards to what the merit-based requirements might be in order to attain office. Meanwhile, an epistocracy is focusing on the kind of merit and the virtues of voters. So in order to vote or maybe have heavily weighted votes, you need to have knowledge in politics. And the more knowledge you have, the more heavier your vote can count. That's kind of on a general understanding of an epistocracy. So an epistocracy kind of looks at the voters and measures the merit and virtues of the voters, and then creates certain kinds of restrictions. And it could even be the case, as with John Stuart Mill, for example, that those who are highly uneducated cannot vote at all in an epistocracy. Whereas a meritocracy, once again, folks have passed certain merit-based requirements. Okay, I got a signal that my connection was a little unstable, so hopefully I'm back now. But we can see the distinction between these two views in that it's possible in an epistocracy that, let's say you only let highly knowledgeable people vote. It's possible that the highly knowledgeable people will vote for someone who could not pass merit-based requirements. Right? They could vote for someone who is incompetent in regards to politics. All right, so I'm going to argue against an epistocracy, argue against democracy regarding minority interests, argue in favor of a view that mixes democracy with a meritocracy. So first, let's look at Brennan's kind of epistocracy and his critique of democracy on minority justice. So he kind of gives a variety of different kinds of criticisms of democracy. One is that experiments in political psychology and in the social sciences, they show that people might know what kinds of outcomes would serve their own interests, but they lack the social scientific knowledge. They lack the knowledge in the social sciences, like knowledge of economics, crime statistics, or even the policy preferences of candidates to know how to vote for policies or candidates that will produce their desired outcomes. So these are fascinating studies showing that, for example, about 75% of the voting population, they don't even know what the policy preferences are of the two main, let's say, presidential candidates, Republican and Democratic presidential candidates, on major issues such as on abortion, the environment, education, and things like that. 75% of voters don't even know that information when they vote for president or for legislators. And if they don't know that, then it shouldn't be too surprising that they don't know economics, crime statistics, various other kinds of facts about international relations, et cetera, and the social sciences that can help make more informed voting decisions. And what these studies are showing is that most minorities, such as women and racial minorities, are too ignorant to know how to properly help themselves at many times in politics. They don't score high on these political competence tests in regards to political knowledge, politically relevant knowledge. So there's this worry in democracies that minorities, in regards to minority interests, that minorities themselves, generally speaking, lack the requisite kinds of factual knowledge in the social sciences to help themselves when voting. Another problem with democracy in regards to minority interests is that minorities, well, largely have less votes. So that's pretty straightforward, and are smaller in number than the majority. So in order to have political power and make change occur, they need to kind of latch on and tie on to other groups to have more political power, more people voting for their interests. A third point is that advantaged voters, such as wealthy employed men in the ethnic majorities, vote at higher rates than the disadvantaged. So when we just look at percentages within a population or category, such as we look at one particular minority group, and we see what their percentage of turnout is, that percentage is lower than, let's say, wealthy, educated, employed white males. So wealthy, educated, white employed males have a much higher percentage of turnout within their demographic group as compared to minority groups. On top of that, I forgot to mention in regards to number one, that the first bullet point there, that it tends to be the case that wealthy, highly educated white males as a demographic score highest on political competence tests. Okay, so now let's discuss, so Brennan uses a lot of this data from the social sciences to say, hey, we can't really trust democracies in regards to minority interests for a variety of reasons. He says most epistocracies, now in regards to an epistocracy, he says most epistocracies distribute voting power to its citizens in proportion to political knowledge and competence, where citizens don't have equal power in voting. All right, so that's the general view of epistocracies as I've discussed before. And as I've said before, there are different variants or versions of an epistocracy. One of them is a restricted suffrage version. This is where no citizen has the immediate right to vote, right? However, those who pass a competency exam or who have certain educational credentials can acquire the right to vote. And those people who don't have those credentials cannot vote, right? That's restricted suffrage. The vote is restricted. However, on this restricted suffrage version of an epistocracy, there is an objection against Brennan, and Brennan himself anticipates this objection against an epistocracy. It's the demographic objection. It's shorthand DO. So the demographic objection states that for an epistocracy, advantaged groups will have more voting power over others. Thus, we will have unfair policies favoring the advantage to the detriment of the disadvantaged minority groups. So if we give most of the voting power to wealthy, educated white males, then they will, the worry here is that they'll vote in ways that will give them their group advantages and in ways that will disadvantage minority groups. So Brennan needs to respond to this demographic objection. And Brennan says that, in response, says that, well, experiments show that minority groups are unlikely to know how to promote their own interests, right, as we've seen before in those studies, and that advantaged groups mostly vote for their perceived national good rather than selfishly, which will be to the benefit of minorities. So there are studies showing that those who are in, score high on the political competence exams, they tend not to vote selfishly for their own self-interest, for their own, for example, financial self-interest, but they tend to vote for the national good, what's kind of morally good for the long-term interests of the country, which should be for the benefit of minorities. So Brennan adopts a restricted suffrage version of an epistocracy. He says it's better for minorities if we restrict the voting power largely to rich, white, educated males. Okay, and they tend to be rich, white, educated males living on the West Coast, like in California and Oregon and Washington. All right, so he's saying, what Brennan says is, let's not let lots of minorities vote, but let's also not let poor white males vote. Let's not let middle income white males vote generally, but let's let the highly educated, rich, wealthy males generally on the West Coast, let's let them vote, and they will vote in favor of minority interests, and they will help minorities. All right, so he says, for instance, high information voters, based on these studies, high information voters endorse smaller government with less interference in the market. So this is actually a conservative, fiscally conservative political position here. Small government, kind of more closer towards laissez-faire, free reign capitalism, free trade. They're pro-choice, so let women choose whether to have abortion or not. That's their choice. Less hawkish on war. They don't like going to war, sending poor people off to war, poor soldiers off to war. They're in favor of using market solutions for healthcare problems. So this is, pro-choice, less hawkish on war. Those are more liberal values. Here we have kind of a mix of liberal conservative values. This is another conservative value here, kind of hands off from the government in regards to handling hospital healthcare matters, and are more accepting of affirmative action. That's liberal. So helping out minorities with racial minorities, for example, with affirmative action. All right, so he says, we let the wealthy, educated white males vote, and we'll have things like this. And we'll have things like pro-choice to help out women. We'll have affirmative action to help out racial minorities, things like that. Okay. So here are some of my objections to Brennan. So there are some conflicting studies about those in the wealthy white males as far as them not voting selfishly, there's some contradicting data. Data unsurprisingly shows that the rich often align on issues most relevant to maintaining their basic economic privileges for their own self-interest. And it also can be seen that having less government interference in the market is for their economic self-interest, right? Having less government restrictions in regards to things like workers' rights, et cetera, can be seen as less government intervention in regards to environmental restrictions. These kinds of things are for their financial self-interest. So they also disfavor government intervention regarding healthcare, as was mentioned. That was kind of right underneath Brennan's nose, but he doesn't quite see that having less government intervention regarding healthcare, such as with universal health care or lowering the price of prescriptions and medical services, or having other government kind of socialized programs such as Medicare and Medicaid, are things that many minority groups are going to want. So it would be to their advantage. So it's not necessarily the case that the wealthy white males will be representing the interests of minority groups in all cases. So these wealthy white male groups, they don't want to increase the welfare state. However, this has a profound effect on poor, many Blacks, and many Latinos. All right, so a second objection I have against Brennan is that studies show that high information voters are tribalistic. All right, so he's thinking that, so there's rampant studies showing that the masses are tribalistic. So if you're not familiar with what tribalism is, it's where this is kind of psychological bias at many times unconscious, in which people will stick with their tribe through thick and thin with their political group. In a way, people's identities, who they are shaped by their moral values, moral and political values. So if they go against their group, in a way, they're rejecting themselves. They're kind of rejecting their very identity, and they would lose their identity, and people don't want to do that, okay? They may not realize that, but they will stick with their tribe, even though their, let's say, presidential candidate is unethical, corrupt, bigoted, etc. They won't be able to see it, all right? But the idea here is, Brennan might say, well, what about the highly educated people, right? They will, highly educated people, won't they not be tribalistic? They'll be able to, see through stuff. But what's interesting is that Brennan doesn't realize there are psychology studies showing that those who are that those who are highly educated are also tribalistic, and at times more tribalistic than less educated people. So I have listed here a Kagan study in which they gave participants various kinds of problems, complex, tricky math problems and science problems where you had to use data. All right, and they then found those subjects, categorized subjects as being high, having high math and science skills, or being low math science skills. And what they found was that, after they made those categorizations, they then gave them science problems in regards to scientific issues that were debated, or that are partisan, that are in politics, like on global warming. And what they found was that, for example, those who have high science, math, reasoning skills, who are conservative, self-identified as conservative, all of a sudden their scientific, mathematical skills went out the window when given data about global warming. And they kept holding on to the position that global warming was true, even when the scientists pointed out, wait, you made a mistake here in your math, etc. And they would just say, no, it just can't be true. And they couldn't give further reasons, but they still held on to their position, even when corrected, no matter what. So this is really interesting. And they were more likely to do that than those test subjects who were categorized in the lower category in regards to math and science skills. So, and there are a bunch of studies like this. There's another study called the backfire effect in psychology, in which people, it's a kind of tribalism kind of finding in which people will things will backfire if you show them contradicting evidence to their political beliefs, in that they'll hold on to their false beliefs even harder, higher on a scale, such as on a Likert scale from 1 to 7, they'll give a higher number, like 7, in regards to the strength of their belief. You show them, they may have a belief, a political belief that is false, and then you give them immediate, uncontroversial visual evidence that their belief is false, and then people will just hold on to their belief even harder. And this backfire effect is more pronounced in those who are more knowledgeable in politics. Okay, so really what these tribalism studies are showing are that democracies are not about individuals having the power to vote and put forth their own policy preferences. Rather, democracies are really about political parties and identity groups, along with their group agendas. It's really a group thing. That's what's going on with democracies. It's about tribes, it's about groups. It's not really about the individual as an individual putting forth their values and their interests, policy preferences, but it's really kind of this tribalistic group thing where their very identities are tied to the values and positions of that group, and they do not want to, in a way, kind of in a metaphysical way, kill themselves by erasing their identity, their personal identity. Brennan wants to place more weight on those who are have higher knowledge, but that's still problematic. And these high information voters can still stick with their tribe and vote for someone who is against minorities and might be bigoted, etc. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of very quickly flesh out my favored position. And I really need a book to actually describe it all, but I'll just give a very brief sketch given our limited time here. So a meritocratic democracy. Remember meritocracy, you guys all know what a democracy is, a Western representative democracy. Meritocracy, once again, is ruled by the merited, in which there are kind of criteria for being able to hold an office, such as being a senator or a president. All right. So, for example, well, let me just hit this first bullet point here. A meritocracy diverges from an epistocracy in that a meritocracy focuses immediately on the virtues of officials rather than voters. There are more stringent criteria for being able to run for office in a meritocracy rather than epistocracy and democracy, right? It's really focusing on who can get in to be in office, not so much on the voters. Where such additional standards are to make it more likely that a leader has the intellectual and moral virtues, such as being wise, fair, diligent, generous, open-minded, compassionate, curious, creative, just, insightful, etc. So this meritocratic democracy, it's heavily discussed in contemporary Confucian philosophy. If you remember Plato in Western philosophy, for those of you who have studied Plato and Plato's philosopher kings idea, that those who should be leaders should be philosopher kings, those who have high education with high marks, have military experience with honors, that's a meritocracy, all right? In order to be in office, you have to have credentials, all right? In Western democracy, generally, you can be a felon, you could be a convicted murderer, rapist, you could not even graduate from high school, not be able to tell the difference between your left thumb and your right thumb, etc. And there's no problem for you to be president in regards to the strict criteria for getting in. All right. So, but the idea with a meritocracy is that, when you guys graduate and have professional jobs, they're going to test for merit. All right. They're going to test for things like college degree. They're going to do a criminal background check and things like that. They're going to do an interview, see how you can think on your feet, your social skills, stuff like that. All right. Well, the idea here is if we do that for professional jobs, then why shouldn't we do that for the most important jobs in the country? All right. So Plato had this analogy with doctors. When we turn to the look for your health, let's say someone unfortunately has cancer. Should they just ask some average person on the street what they should do, or should they go to a medical doctor? Well, obviously, you should go to a medical doctor. Then Plato makes the analogy. Well, we should do the same thing in regards to the health of the state. We should turn to experts, philosophers, right? And of course, back then, philosophers were just, philosopher, everything, all branches of knowledge fell under philosophy. So with a meritocratic democracy, the idea here is, should we just have a popularity contest for determining who's the best leader or a democracy, or should we have merit-based requirements? I've kind of fused a kind of hybrid view. I won't go into great detail contrasting it with contemporary Confucian philosophers, but it's different from contemporary Confucian political philosophers in that for national legislative and executive officials, they're all democratically elected. So they're all democratically elected, so that remains the same. But they must demonstrate their merit to an examination body in order to be able to run for office. So in order to be able to put your name on the ballot, you have to pass through certain merit-based hoops. All right, and there's going to be a bunch of people who can do it, but those people who do it, you can then put your name on the ballot. All right, you've jumped through some hoops such that we have some epistemic justification that you have a sufficient level of merit. And then it's up to a vote. Then the people vote on those people who jump through the hoops. All right. So on my view, all the offices, it's still democracy. Everyone is equal, one person, one vote. It's all equal. No one has more weighted votes or anything like that. Everyone gets to vote. The only difference is that there are criteria to be able to put your name on the ballot for the vote. All right, and since our focus is on minority justice, I won't go through the whole list of merit-based criteria that I have. I'll only go through some of them that are relevant to minority interests. So one thing we could have is have greater childhood education activities. So what psychology studies are showing are when people work together in diverse teams, then they become more accepting of people who might look differently from them. Okay, so having childhood education where we have diverse teams, which could involve different schools coming together to work together if a school lacks diversity. So trying to have these kinds of exercises when possible. Also education of race relations, sexism, things like this at a young age. All right, so, and the idea here, the kind of model is just as sex education, at first, a lot of families, a lot of parents didn't want to have that in schools. Right now in schools, there's debate like in Florida about whether there should be education at a young age in regards to gay rights and things like that, to be able to even say those words. But the idea here is when we have sex education, or the kind of model to look at is when we had sex education, educating, all of a sudden teenage pregnancies for teenage women or girls dropped off dramatically. All right, dramatic drop in teenage pregnancies. And the idea is to have various kinds of educational programs, people working in diverse teams, like through academics, maybe art or something like that, or academic competitions, as well as education of things like race and sexism at an impressionable young age, that can help. All right, and I'm open that ultimately it's an empirical question. If psychologists find other things that are better for education, then I'm all for it. All right, so whatever the data leads to, let's do it. College level classes, so education even in higher education, not only in childhood education growing up, but college level classes would be required in service ethics, for example, where You learn about ethics, but you also have to go out into the community helping people in need, communities in need. So having that kind of hands-on experience. So, here, is the idea stemming from Aristotle and Confucius is that, knowledge is one thing about ethics and doing the right thing, but really what's most important is habit and having the virtues, the kind of dispositions, the long-term dispositions that tend to manifest themselves over a wide variety of environments. And that requires shaping culture, having the right kind of culture and cultural shaping, especially at a young age, all the way through. So having people actually go out into the community, doing service ethics things, taking classes in regards to that can enhance their knowledge of other cultures like international relations, taking normative classes such as in political philosophy, about what the principles of justice should be, taking a variety of those kinds of classes to learn more about diversity. Also, experience in local government. In order to make it into national office, have prior experience in local government, scoring high on various indices, such as maintaining or reducing the hate crime rate, having strong economic indicators for minorities. Let me just also say for the college level classes, on my view, my meritocratic democracy, it's a requirement to have full publicly funded public universities. All right, private universities, they can charge whatever they want. They're privately owned. But just like in high school, we have public schools, also have fully funded public schools for college. Sac State is already partially funded, kind of socialized in that respect. The masses are tribalistic and have pernicious psychological biases for democracy, epistocracy, and meritocratic democracy. I can't really escape tribalism and these bad psychological biases that were discussed previously, because I'm allowing for a full-on democracy in regards to everyone getting to vote and everyone having an equal vote. So yes, the people are going to be tribalistic and have these psychological biases, but I believe meritocratic democracy does better for minority rights as compared to the competition. It's not perfect, and yes, even with my system, there can be unmerited people who slip through the cracks. That can be possible, but it's less likely on my view. It makes my view, it's less likely, and it makes it less likely to have bigoted officials. It makes it more likely that officials will look out for minorities than the competitors, right? They've shown that they have prior experience in local government, right? Helping out minorities in various ways and being able to work with and have the social skills and leadership influence to help motivate people to work for minorities and for the benefit of minorities. They've taken, they're college educated, taking college level classes in regards to minority interests. There's education even through childhood at an impressionable age, working with minorities. Right, so this makes it more likely. Yes, there can be people who slip through the cracks and who are bigoted and racist, sexist, etc. That can still seep through on my system. But the idea here is, we're not going to find a perfect form of government. So let's just try to find one that's better. All right, and I think with these merit-based hoops that need to be jumped through in order to put your name on the ballot, that makes it more likely than just a democracy that doesn't have these merit-based requirements. And it makes it more likely for an epistocracy, because an epistocracy, has tribalism, and the people can just vote for someone to be in office who is bigoted, and there are no merit checks on those who get into office on an epistocracy. But a meritocracy does have merit checks on those who are who can make it to office. So, I think my view is more likely to have meritorious, virtuous leaders in regards to minority justice. And, people, it's somewhat, almost assumed to be true, almost dogma in Western philosophy that democracy is the best form of government. Winston Churchill once said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms. And that's kind of generally held in Western thought, that democracy is the best form of government. But I believe we can do better. I believe there's something at least slightly better. And if it's slightly better, then it is better than democracy. And that's a meritocratic democracy. All right, so with that, I'll just end here, and any questions or objections, feel free. Or thoughts or clarification questions. Yeah, Rex.
Would you say that what you're advocating here is a sort of development of, I guess, the classical republicanism of Polybius, Cicero, Aristotle, that sort of thing?
Well, republicanism can involve a lot of things. It can, but it is kind of a more conservative. The meritocratic element is a kind of conservative element to it. So in that respect, yes, in regards to having merit-based criteria, it does have more ancient roots in the ancient world, especially most articulated with Plato. All right, so I don't want to get into republicanism. Can also include things on like how much liberty should government provide, such as having some kind of contemporary Republican theorists like Philip Pettit endorse things like, he thinks a constitutional democracy is going to be the best form of government. I don't necessarily agree with that as far as contemporary Republican theorists go. And I don't necessarily endorse their views on how much liberty governments should provide. And it tends to be, Republican theorists tend to advocate for a high degree of liberty for the people. But there is a kind of ancient, at least in the West, an ancient kind of throwback to my views. It does tend to also be the case that conservatives tend, while liberals do, emphasize merit and things like that, Republicans tend to put more emphasis on merit and earning it, and some conservatives say we shouldn't even have a welfare state because you have to earn it. It's about merit and things like that. So there are some elements of that in my view, but my most predominant influence is from contemporary Confucian philosophers who have really kind of developed this well before I've thought of it, and I'm kind of piggybacking on their ideas. And they've created a kind of meritocratic democracy that is more amenable for Eastern countries, given their values in the East. But what I'm trying to do is create a hybrid view that is more amenable to Western liberal democracies, Western democracies, in that I've allowed everyone to maintain their vote. All adult citizens can still vote, and their vote all counts equally. So I've made it more palatable, I believe, for Western democracies in that respect. Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, I worry about the criteria you've listed out here a little bit. Sort of specifically, I see two concerns, that it sort of favors the urban over the sort of rural kind of unnecessarily, and that it favors the affluent, or those that grew up affluent. The first one of those might be, as they say, a feature, not a bug, but like, I'm from the foothills. That's where I grew up and went to high school. Super, super, super white community. And just to be clear, racist as hell. Like that, like I'm not here praising the virtue of the community and everything, but like in terms of like, childhood education, of working with diverse teams and everything, that just wouldn't be on the table for such people. And all of the guys' schools are all also really, really white, and also these schools are all really, really poor, can't really afford to be bussing whole schools out, whole classes out to all these different places. And I appreciate that college is paid for on this, because I had that concern, but you addressed the college thing. College is paid for, but I still like there. People are going to have more access to the kinds of things, and ultimately like more success in college still, that still favors people with, more affluent backgrounds growing up. They kind of have the habitus needed to have success there. So those are my concerns with the criteria.
Yeah, so I did say, so the childhood education activities, I did say when possible. So if they're not possible, then they're just not possible, and those people can still run for office. So there are going to be situations in which that's not feasible. So I do realize that. It's that first bullet point is not an absolute requirement in order to put your name on the ballot. All right, it's kind of an ideal, but that's right. It's not possible in certain cases. It does tend to be the case that people born into wealthier families do tend to make it to college, more likely make it to college and things like that. But there are poor people who do make it. All right, so there are going to be candidates. So it's not eliminating poor people. Now, does it make it less likely? Well, given the data, yes, it does make it less likely. But the idea here is that, it makes it less likely for poor people people born into poor families to be medical doctors, for example. But we're willing to do that because in order to be a doctor, you need the merit, right, for people's health. And so you're not going to, mess someone's health up. It requires a high degree of intelligence and education and training. So we just need to do that in this case. So if we're going to do that for medical doctors, then we need to do that for more important jobs, the most important jobs in a country, where, like the president of the United States or a senator or a congressperson, we're just going to have to, place more emphasis on merit in those respects. Once again, given my criteria, those people who do make it, it's still perfectly open for poor people, especially with public funded universities, to still make it. And there will be people who make it. But if there's someone who's from a wealthy family, remember that they would have done things to provide reason to believe that they will still help out minority groups, the poor, women, racial minorities, sexual, LGBTQ community, etc., given their, for example, prior experience in local government scoring high on certain indices like low hate crimes. So those are kind of my ways to buttress my position. But yeah, those are interesting points you brought up.
I'd like to come in with something as well, and particularly like why, as somebody who wants to be a politician, why I like this idea. First and foremost, because it doesn't necessarily represent a huge change to the system as it currently is, right? At least not in the sense of there being some kind of meritocratic-ish check on who gets into public office, because there is that to some extent. There's as you say, exceptions to rules like these, but for the most part, in like non-Trumpian cases, you do have to get the blessing of whatever political organization or party that happens to be most salient for your the sought office. So there are these checks, and they do manifestly in our current system, they manifestly over benefit the very wealthy, and obviously in the urban environments as well. So for there to be an official meritocratic system in place that is the same for everybody could be a improvement on that without being a fundamental change to the way democracy normally function. There's always going to be some kind of check in place on it. And what that means is that having it be standardized or at least systematized could be significantly beneficial for the diversity of people that you find in elected offices. Even accepting that the system doesn't exist in a vacuum, like it's still naturally going to benefit people who are from wealthier castes. So yeah, that's part of it. Another thing I like about it is that there being a system in place for doing meritocratic checks allows for the public financing of elections to be significantly logistically easier, right? Where you have if people can pass the test, if people can appeal to the board, I guess, and let's say it's like a select committee in whatever municipal government is one rung below the government you want to, the level of government where you want to hold office. If anybody who can pass that check gets a certain amount of campaign funding, with that radically levels the playing field in terms of politics and how it can happen.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Yeah, you could try to get more equal campaign finances and things like that using this system. That's an interesting idea to do. And there definitely is that problem because it does tend to be the rich who have these national positions. Make it in politics, it could, in significant part, because it takes a lot of money and advertising dollars and things like that to make it. But then you start seeing democracies, Western democracies, really being plutocracies, which is ruled by the wealthy. That is a worry, and it could be possible to try to equal the playing field with this system.
Yeah. And additionally to that, like if you have public financing of elections, this is a sort of separate thing, but if you have public financing of elections, you get a much more democratic process more generally, which is to say that people are more likely to get elected who can appeal to the people, the voting bloc. And sometimes that happens in a very reasonable way, where the thing you're advocating for is, let's say, Medicare for all. And this is which is a wildly popular suggestion for what it is. And for the point in the policy realm that it occupies right now, the idea behind one of the corollary benefits of having a meritocratic system and public financing of elections tied to those meritocratic checks would be that there is a more robust democratic process following that meritocratic check is what I mean to suggest. And that's an idea. I'll turn it over to Daniel now, but I do have my concerns as well with the notion.
Okay.
Okay, so I just sort of had this is a food for thought question type of thing. So
okay.
in semesters past, we've had Professor Swan here come and talk about anarchy and basically make the argument like the solution to sort of tribalistic government abuses and such is to do away with the whole sodding business. So functionally, I'm asking, why should we adopt your solution rather than his? Why should we adopt this this meritocratic democracy rather than just be rid of the whole governmental process entirely and not have to deal with tribalism at all in regards to political interference in our life?
I'm not familiar with his view on anarchy. And I'm sure it might be nuanced in certain kinds of ways, but just kind of full on anarchy, if it's no government at all, you're going to start running into Hobbesian worries about a state of nature and things like that. And life is going to be poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So I'm sure he has a sophisticated view to try to get around that somehow. But you run into that kind of worry, at least initially at face value. And then on top of that, on my view, the idea here is, yeah, people are going to be tribalistic, but the only people that they can vote for are ones in which we have good reason to believe that they're going to be good in office. All right, so that's my response to the tribalism studies, is I've kind of built this system that we can't get rid of tribalism. In a way, it's kind of like Hume said, Hume said, don't try to change human nature. You can't do it, right? So, Hume said in part of his political philosophy, there's this question, why should we have laws with punishment? Why should we have punishment of the laws? Why not just have laws? Can't people see that if you don't obey the laws, then we're going to go into a state of nature and it's just going to be chaos and disorder? So people can see that, right? They're rational and they can see that. So we don't need to enforce the laws because people are just going to abide by the laws, whatever they are. But Hume said, well, it's part of human nature that most people are don't look out for their long-term self-interest. They can't see that far into the future about a state of nature and all that stuff. So don't try to change human nature, but rather make it within people's short-term self-interest to want to obey the laws by enforcing the laws. Now it's in their short-term self-interest to not break the law, or else they're going to be punished. Likewise, don't try to change human nature here in regards to tribalism. People are going to be tribalistic generally. But what you can do is change the system such that they're going to be tribalistic, but they can only vote for people in which we have epistemic justification to believe that those people are merit.
It's this really strange phenomenon. The longer I study philosophy, the more I find myself agreeing with David Hume. And I ain't gonna lie, I'm not terribly thrilled.
He's one of my favorites. Him and Nietzsche are my two most favorite, and they're both skeptics. So I'm definitely like, yeah, I'm a card carrying skeptic. I'm part of the skeptic school of philosophy myself. So I wouldn't be embarrassed holding Hume, being a Humean, but it can be a bad name in many circles because you're just skeptical. But to be a philosopher is to have a skeptical mind. So.
It just like blows my, because for the first handful of years in philosophy, I would audibly boo. So what do we think about Hume? I would audibly boo in class and would get scolded by my teacher to say that no emoting in response. And now I find myself he makes good points about some things, not about other things, but about
He's a
some
smart
things.
guy. He's a smart guy. Yeah, he's definitely my top two.
Did anyone else have any questions? Rex, go for it.
To butt in on Daniel's comment about Hume, because I'm someone who didn't like him for a while. What really made me understand his skepticism, something that I think a lot of philosophy students miss, is the fact that he was a historian. He was trying to understand causation in a historical sense, and he applied that to metaphysics.
Yeah, he's also a historian in other ways. I think during his time, some of his most famous writing was I think he wrote a history of England or history of Britain or something like that, which was quite popular.
I remember that, yeah.
Anything else?
William, you had more, right?
Oh, I always have more. I always have more, but I do want to make sure that we give some of this time, especially in
there's someone in the
phase to people
in the chat. History of Scotland.
History of Scotland.
Oh, that's even better.
Yeah, he was Scottish. That's right.
Just wanted to, so before and maybe without my going further, I wanted to make sure we're putting everyone else in the group here in a position to speak. So yeah, just you don't even have to raise your hand at this stage. You can just chime on in. Okay, so one of the concerns I have, and this is still going to be to the effect that a meritocratic democracy can be a better system. It's just not complete. It doesn't at least conceptually, it doesn't seem to be completely without some of the shortcomings of the system we currently work with. So the thing I'm thinking of is political inertia. Now inertia is resistant to change, so that's kind of self-explanatory, I hope, given politics as it is. Inertia is not inherently a bad thing, We have a history at the executive branch of swapping ideologies radically very often, such that, for example, we entered into a geopolitical like nuclear agreement with the country of Iran, and then in the very next administration broke with that deal, and now we're trying to get it back because the Democrats are back in power. And such, and it's just gonna it goes on like that backwards in time. It's probably going to keep going like that forwards in time. So inertia is the resistance to that kind of thing as well, but it's also resistance to better policy. Like, it's very difficult to once a candidate is incumbent, it's very difficult to unseat that candidate, almost regardless of the features of the district from which that candidate comes. So, like, it tends to be, and this is the function of political machines. It's the function of disparities of wealth. It's the function of voter disenfranchisement and jading. But the point is that it's just that it's got this inertial quality to it, where there's natural resistance in a system without, or at least a part of the system without term limits, to keep the same people in power indefinitely, or rather, resistance to changing them, swapping them out according to the will of the people. So that's because that's functional of a broadly corrupt system, and I think a broadly corrupt system can be ameliorated and repaired in ways that I would tie into the idea of a meritocratic democracy. I'm not going to hold that against the idea of meritocratic democracy. That might emerge, it might not. It wouldn't be functional of meritocratic democracy per se. The thing I wonder about with meritocratic democracy and inertia is based on who is doing the criteria, who's writing the selection criteria, because I think it's natural that they should change with circumstances. That it would be the wrong move to enshrine them in the Constitution, like the, I don't know, $20 tort, part of it. It would be because obviously the relative educational gaps, I suppose, are changing all the time as well. For example, if we have like particular criteria regarding knowledge base, we would say, I think in 2022, we would write those criteria like, okay, you have to have X score on this test about critical theory. You have to understand a little bit of this, or at least this much of critical theory, in order to qualify to be a politician, to be an office holder. And as tying it to, a particular school of thought or a particular academic discipline means that the test will naturally have to change over time as that school of thought evolves. Sometimes that'll mean straightforwardly that you have to know more stuff. Other times it will mean you have to have followed this like paradigm shift, right? Because critical theory didn't always exist. It represents in itself a sort of paradigm shift, and that's just one example of like an academic field. But in addition, like what it means to serve a local community well is changing over time, just because the features of those communities are changing, so on and so forth. Like, so the criteria need to be adaptable. Therefore, they need to be like decided on by people, and not just one group of people writing a constitution, but people over time. And
yeah, I do have it in my larger theory that there's a committee that can change the requirements over time. And there could be like better tests that come. It could be for a variety of reasons. There might be some subject matters that are more important that just given current events and things like that need to be implemented. And so I do have like a kind of like a bipartisan committee for coming up with that criteria. And yeah, generally there are going to be still issues like with inertia in regards to my view. The idea here is just as a first response, those are going to be problems with democracy too. So we're both on the same level playing field in that respect. They're both equally the same problem, but my view can do better in regards to, let's say, minority justice. So that places my view higher than democracy. So I'm okay with problems existing for both democracy and meritocratic democracy, so long as meritocratic democracy has certain benefits over democracy, given the meritocracy component to it. There could be certain things, though, implemented, on my view, that allows for more stability. So the idea with merit, with officials who have passed certain merit-based requirements, is that they have merited or earned longer terms in office. So there could be longer terms in office to hold, treaties or accords with Iran longer in place. So those actually could be put in. And in a way, straightforwardly, the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, is a meritocracy. So entry is by merit. And due to that, they have lifetime appointments. I'm not advocating lifetime appointments for the legislative and executive branches, but on my system, it can open the door for longer terms because it's merit. There are other benefits to having longer terms. You're not, some benefits of having longer terms are that you can really look out for the long-term interests of the country instead of, always having an election around the corner. So you're trying to satisfy the short-term interests of the masses. You can go against the tyranny of the majority, go against the people for the betterment of the country. You can also look out for non-voters like poor who tend not to vote, non-human animals, the environment, future generations, right? If you have an election around the corner all the time, then you're just looking out for those who actually are voters, who are registered voters, right? Not necessarily looking out for others. So those are some benefits. There are also some weaknesses of having longer terms, such as, if someone has a long term and they're corrupt or bigoted or whatever, well, then they're going to be in office for a while. The idea is here to find a happy medium that's not going to be perfect, but is better, and if they've passed certain merit-based requirements, then that itself can merit longer terms in office for more stability.
So, okay, Rex, go. I'll bring something in later if I want to.
So this is worst case scenario, playing off of what came to mind with the analogy to the Supreme Court and some of the ideological points that William brought up. But hypothetically, when you have a democratic republic, as the United States is, and you enable a sort of reform that requires, for better or worse, I'm not taking a stance of agreement or disagreement here, that would require the people entering politics either take some sort of ideological oath or have some sort of specific background in their careers. Hypothetically, I'm thinking analogously to the transition of republic to empire in Rome. Isn't this where you get a system that appears democratic but is literally imperial behind the scenes? Couldn't that
could be a
be
worry?
risk?
That could be a worry. My criteria, though, in a way, they're ideological, but they're ideological in regards, anything that is ideological is in regards to values of a liberal democracy, where a liberal democracy is a technical term in regards to believing in democracy, separation of powers, checks and balances, equality, a large amount of freedom for citizens to live their lives as they so choose, as long as they don't harm other people, things like that. So in regards to, my criteria that can check for merit in regards to minority justice, that's in regards to what is, I take a widely held value about equal treatment that conservatives and liberals generally have or ought to have. It's just part of Western liberal democracy, part of a foundation. About equality and equal treatment. Any kinds of criteria I have that are kind of normative or ideological, I'm attempting to make them generally ideological in regards to values that generally should be held in a Western democracy. Now, as far as ideology between liberals and conservatives, like on the political spectrum sense, I don't advocate for having any tests, for example, that test to make sure you have your, to the left or to the right or in the middle. So only if there are tests, they're all non-ideological. They'll just be kind of general, like critical thinking or logic tests. There's an interesting test that's developed that is an accurate predictor for whether politicians are able to predict future events, such as an oncoming recession or oncoming war. So that would be a test that could be implemented for politicians, future politicians at the national level. And that's non-ideological. It's just purely based on kind of social science, your ability to predict social science events, not whether you're a liberal or a conservative or a moderate or anything like that. So those are the kinds of tests I would advocate for, non-ideological tests.
Okay, that makes sense. And hopefully in this day and age, we have the intelligence to avoid a transition of that sort. But yeah, that does make sense.
The worry from like my camp and things is that over time, as tests, as a meritocratic system is implemented, but the tests obviously needs to be capable of evolving with changing circumstances, changing requirements for people in office, maybe changing administrative roles that those people in office play. That can happen too. Those tests need to be built by people, and it's possible for people to build an Overton window into that test in some way.
Yeah. So there would have to be that's itself set up for like the examination committee to not be biased in a certain kind of way. So you could have, for example, the senior members, they must be diverse, representing a variety of different backgrounds and views. You could implement and you could have strict rules set in place in regards to non-ideological tests and things like that. So there would have to be certain kinds of in practical implementation of the examination committee to try to not have that kind of bias. And we do have things like organizations like, for example, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, that makes economic predictions on possible legislation that's going through Congress. They are doing generally a fairly good job of being nonpartisan. All right, and they have various kinds of mechanisms put in place to try to be more objective and fair and nonpartisan in their economic outputs. So those like kinds of criteria can be put in place regarding the examination committee. But that is a legitimate worry.
Yeah, for sure. And it's worth noting that doesn't mean this would be like suddenly a worse system than the plutocratic system that we currently occupy.
Right. Right.
We're trying to like flesh it out, make it even better, but it's still like a fairly obvious, straightforward improvement.
I think so. I might be biased though, but I have my reasons. As a listener.
I am just chiming in here and say, typically we do run these things 7:30 to 8:30. This is not to shoo you out of here, Professor Park, but rather to be considerate of your time and also to sort of let other people know that if y'all have to get out of here, we totally understand. Me and William can talk and listen and go for forever, but we understand if other people can't, or if there are constraints on your time, Professor Park.
Okay, yeah, I do have to get going. I do have other work and stuff to do tonight. Yeah. So, but yeah, it was good talking with you guys, and
for sure.
It's always good seeing you again, Daniel. So
likewise, stingers.
I'm still upset that you never joined my ethics debate team.
I had so many things.
Hey!
I was trying to get. I finally got my podcast going off the ground with a buddy, and we got a YouTube channel now. But it was just forever trying to get that going and just helping take care of my grandma. Just the constraints on my time.
Yeah, that's understandable.
what wasn't going to work. It would have been fun. It sounds like it was fun. I have been I have been told by multiple people like, yeah, you should have done this. This would have been fun, dude. But it is what it is.
I tried convincing him as well.
All right. Well, I do have to get going, and it was good talking with you guys. And yeah, feel free if you have further questions or anything to send me an email or something like that, or take my political philosophy class.
Woot, woot.
If only.
Take it easy.
I'm almost done here. Yeah, again, thank you, Professor Park, for dropping in. We'll probably, we're gonna continue this like probably conversation, but I'm going also to go ahead and stop the recording in a second here. So let me just outro. I'm not good at these. Thank you everybody who came by, especially Professor Park and everybody else who is watching later on. Yeah, follow this channel or whatever it is, and also check out. He didn't drop the name. I'm gonna drop it. Shock and Autism, the podcast that is. I listen to it on Spotify. I believe it's where other podcasts are. So yeah, check that out as well. It's Daniel thing. It's not super philosophical until I show up.
It dabbles in philosophy here and there and such. It's a life podcast, and there's a particular episode where we have a guest host by the name of one William Wyatt, who you might possibly want to check out.
He sounds like the worst. Okay, cool. Yeah. Again, thank you for everybody. Philosophy Club will continue to happen. It's going to be every once in a while something like this. Okay. Thank you and good night. Drive safe or don't drive at all. That's the deal. Okay. Bye.
See you guys.